Welcome back to The Good Forest. We've been considering Usylvania through the lenses of 4 categories, each of which can help us to think about the good forest in different ways. Last time, we covered the category of companionship. It's the second collectivity after nature that informs an analysis of Usylvanian aims. Companionship includes those to whom we can reach out in this world, a living community, a community in space. We can think also of a different kind of community, one that is complementary to that of companionship, and that informs the third Usylvanian category. This is the collectivity of heritage, which can be thought of as being constituted not primarily of a community in space, but rather of a community in time. Heritage stems from hereditare, to inherit, that which is transmitted from one's ancestors and which may be transmitted in turn to one's descendants. A community in time. It's not a tangible forest, but it's all the same real and impactful, an enshrouded forest of those who have come before and those who will come after. Through investigations of what we've inherited, we can query our ancestors and the past more generally on issues pertaining to the quadrants already discussed. A Usylvanian perspective focuses particularly upon Western histories, upon Western pasts. This is the locus of our own heritage, that cluster of human endeavour and tradition with which we most resonate. There is a history of relating to nature in the West, as well as a history concerning companionship, concerning the ways in which society has been shaped and elaborated. Through our investigation of these areas of research, we can discover the roots of our rationalization efforts in these spheres, the economization and exploitation of natural and social systems that was touched upon in the previous presentation. Worthy of mention also is the history of heritage itself, the historical development in how we conceptualize history and how we apply it. Considering various Western outlooks on the past, we can think most basically on oral histories as connected to particular peoples, on family histories, including ancestral rites of devotion, also on related tales of heroes and gods. We can think additionally on later written histories that brought greater sophistication to the subject of heritage, but that in some ways were less intimate. Histories that date, for example, from the periods of Greek and Roman antiquity. We can think further on the works of medieval chroniclers and other historians of Christendom, on state, royal, and aristocratic histories. Also, on a kind of democratization of history that accompanied the spread of literacy in the West. And, of course, we can think of various more recent historical approaches which have tended to spotlight previously neglected perspectives, often employing novel interpretative strategies. These include different quantitative techniques, as well as various kinds of social, environmental, and psychological methodologies. To raise a number of contemporary large-scale trends in the heritage quadrant, we can see first of all with regard to Western pasts, a general widening of the historical frame, extending in recent times from narratives of nation-states in their intranational territories to those of international regions and trans-global exchanges. Among contemporary historians, there have been calls to broaden Western historical narratives, with a highlighting of the interrelationships of peoples from around the globe. There have also been calls to deepen the way in which we look at our past, seeking to connect recorded histories with reconstructions of prehistorical events, a task facilitated through knowledge gains in such disciplines as archaeology, linguistics, and genetics. As part of this deepening of historical outlooks, there have been motions as well to connect our cultural stories with those of Earth's natural history, linking patterns of human behaviour and accomplishment with features and developments in our natural environments and with forms and processes in Earth's distant past. In the modern day, we've also seen in view of Western histories a consistent highlighting of various negative aspects of those cultures and polities that can be regarded as constituting the historical West, ranging from criticisms of classical civilizations like ancient Rome and Greece, to critiques of modern nation-states and the European populations of which they're, in large measure, composed. Much more widespread than the foregoing, arguably, has been the general forgetting of Western historical narratives, in favour of identities, for example, of a commercialised present and technologised future, the older local, regional and national stories often giving way in the process. Fueled by commercial activity and consumption, retrospection and heritage have yielded here to a prospective attitude, an attitude driven, no doubt, by economic prospectors of various kinds. To be sure, given the many creature comforts and luxuries in our societies, our attention to matters of heritage have lessened considerably in recent times. In a state of indulgence and plenty, one is tempted perhaps not to think much at all of the past. Indeed, there is encouragement to forget, to let go, to divert one's attention to present amusement and pastimes. When the time dimension is taken into account, it's often in the context of an envisioned utopia, a technologized tomorrowland by which humanity may escape from its past altogether. It's a vision that centers upon predicted advances in science and engineering, one that's continually stoked by commercial and capital interests, and that's promulgated to the public through a constant stream of advertisements, news items, and entertainment productions. This can be contrasted to previous periods, when looking back was much more common, with a large-scale shift in perspective occurring notably in the 19th century, when the speed of change began to reorient the collective consciousness toward a new tomorrow, always on the horizon. There is some good to be identified in all of these trends, if not taken too far. We have seen, more and more, for instance, the ways in which regional and world spheres of interest are interlinked, how historical cultures and states have impacted upon one another and have been shaped by their respective environments. Also, of how different peoples are linked over time as the result of past cultural encounters and exchanges. History, in this sense, has continued to move, refining its conclusions in commendable ways. It's worth recognizing, however, that such historical linkages can be used, inimically, as means of dissolving the states and cultures concerned, of effacing their histories in the service of current economic interests, and of social objectives as defined by various ruling elites. We might compare this argument for the dissolution of a culture to one that asks for the dissolution and effacement of an individual's personal identity on account of his or her linkages to other people. An absurd argument, to be sure, but one that might prove instructive when assessing the integrity and cohesiveness of social groups. Just as we're apt to employ a principle of self-determination in behalf of the individual in question, so we should consider its application in the instance of self-aware social collectives. We can use this personal analogy in reflecting also upon the other mentioned trends. As an individual, a certain circumspection, first of all, one that entails the critical consideration of one's past actions and includes an examination of other people's viewpoints, should be welcomed, if it leads to a stronger identity, a healthier outlook and future course. Criticism, of course, ceases to be productive when it demotivates, demoralizes, and depresses the person concerned, when it poisons, for example, a person's self-conception with a paralyzing sense of guilt or shame. What is valid for this somebody, of course, can be applied to the body politic. Constructive criticism and the careful appraisal of other frames of reference can lead to a strengthening of the group and its cultural character, while destructive criticism and the exaltation of external standpoints often results in a further breakdown or degradation of a group's general self-regard. On the forgetting of history, we can imagine a man whose access to his own personal memories, his own personal past, has been restricted by some means, whether through some artificial device or by some organic disease. We can readily understand in this case that such a restriction will lead for the man to an observable shrinkage in his sense of himself, the loss of knowledge and perspective concerning his past actions and experiences, contributing to a visible narrowing, not only of where he senses himself in his present life, but also of where he may envision himself in the future. This kind of forgetting can lay a person open to all manners of suggestion, some perhaps well-intended, others decidedly not. We can think here of various governmental and non-governmental ventures that seek to refashion historical identities in the interest of current socio-economic goals. Ventures that seek to remodel and displace old identities in the establishment of a new one. An envisaged man of tomorrow, perhaps, a future human deemed more amenable to the interests and norms of ruling regimes. The dizzying speed of historical change throughout the modern period has, of course, contributed to our collective forgetting. We have persistently fallen short in our processing of what has occurred in our societies, lurching instead from one supposed new age into another, ever pulled into a new techne, a new tomorrow. We can thus observe in various modern contexts an alienation from our histories, an estrangement from our heritage and forebears, except, for example, where it may bolster assorted commercial identifications or help in the realization of certain political designs. It's an alienation that complements those forms of estrangement already seen in the nature and companionship realms. There is a restlessness to be observed in the modern Westerner, one that contributes to the problems mapped out in previous presentations. It can be explained, at least in part, through a kind of cultural amnesia that afflicts him or her. An instability of selfhood and shallowness of historical memory, conditions that he or she may find at least partially allayed through various kinds of consumptive practices and pursuits. This kind of amnesia aside, the other mentioned heritage trends can be seen to contribute to this instability as well. A narrative confusion, for example, about one's place in the world, that comes from a dislocation of one's history or its engulfment into a larger whole. Also, the burdening of one's history with too much negative feeling, with a paralyzing sense, for instance, of guilt or shame. Feelings that thwart a healthful historical embrace, the honouring and upholding of one's historical roots. As in the realms of nature and companionship, one may not feel subjectively a loss of heritage per se, especially if never having experienced the fruits of this realm. What may be experienced instead is a kind of generalized uneasiness, a nebulous agitation, anxiety, or apathy about one's standing in the world. Here, we would claim that one's personal exploration of the heritage realm can work wonders, unlocking new sources of personal meaning, energy, and intention. By embarking on new voyages of historical discovery and inspection, an individual can help steer him or herself to new waters of self-awareness and hope. As in the quadrants already covered, a Usilvanian approach in the heritage realm presumes a kind of localism, as realized through a concentration upon Western historical contexts, focusing upon the natural, social, and cultural histories of the West, historical patterns of generally European provenance. In our investigation of what has been inherited here, of what has been passed down, we may note that such a Western focus encompasses, as it were, but one forest on a much vaster historical plane. From a Usilvanian standpoint, however, we may consider this territory beyond this larger plane as itself foris, as outside our outside, as it were, as lying at least in general outline beyond our purposes and concerns. A Western focus is meant, of course, neither to ignore important differences in countries and cultural zones which may be said to constitute such a West, nor to unduly neglect identified un-Western societal patterns and developments. It's a compromise solution, looked at both ways, one that appears as both worthwhile and productive given the many resonances seen across Western cultures and peoples. Heritage, we can affirm, is something living, something that we continually tend to and care for. We can see heritage as comprising, first of all, the supposed historical facts that can be assembled from various sources, what actually happened, we might say, as pieced together to the best of our abilities. Though elusive and fragile, such evidence of past events can look rather solid and durable in comparison to the values that we apply to these events, how we interpret the historical data that we're met with, as well as how we prioritize these findings and keep them present in our lives. There are constant choices to make in the framing and upholding of one's heritage. It is indeed an implicitly perspectival enterprise, one that, by necessity, implicates the viewer concerned, including his or her natural inclinations and aspirations. Although efforts to scientize history are, at least in some instances, to be lauded, for they can lead to novel and potentially useful interpretations, we should transcend 19th and 20th century attempts to decisively objectify history. We should rather historicize these very efforts of objectification, seeing them, in fact, as part of a larger story of scientization in the West, of the rationalization of modern life. History, above all, is to be remembered and processed anew, in a way that doesn't recoil from episodes and events of judged iniquity and darkness, but that doesn't wallow in them either. A widening and deepening of history is, for us, also welcome, but not at the expense of narratives of more particular places and peoples. There is a recognized good in exploring the many sides of a given event, historical personage or era, but heritage, as wielded by any given individual or collective, will always remain relatively localized. It will always remain, to a degree, perspectival and subjective, formulated as much with an eye toward future possibilities as to past outcomes. There is, indeed, a time-bound specificity to one's experience of history, to one's exercising of remembrance of one sort or another. It is not possible to uncover, review, and deliberate upon all of history, of course, either personally or collectively. Instead, we, as well as all other bearers of history, choose particular segments of the past to emphasize as a living heritage, highlights that help to orient us in the present moment and guide us towards envisioned ends. Here again, we can draw a comparison to one's personal history, for we as individuals tend to foreground certain aspects of our subjective pasts, depending on where we currently see ourselves and where we'd like to go, interpreting our pasts in ways that are supportive of personal priorities and aims. This is natural and normal. a felt heritage is, indeed, a living and time-bound creature. We should undoubtedly be on guard against pre-packaged histories of one sort or another. No matter one's identity in the heritage realm, such historical capital as it may be called, can of course be seized, exploited and subverted, in service perhaps of someone else's future, of someone else's past. We should ask not only what history, but also whose. Whence comes this interpretation? Etymologically, interpret stems from interpres, meaning an agent or translator. We can thus ask, who is this agent behind a given interpretation, and for whose benefit has a given set of events been translated? We see a need not only to remember Western histories in the ways outlined, but to reinterpret them, recalling, for instance, the older narratives of the past, but with a discerning eye. For if the more recent histories might be found to be too condemning in certain respects, the older histories might be seen as too exculpatory, self-satisfied and provincial, being in some cases also celebratory of various outmoded manifestations of dominion and control. History is always subject to current needs and viewpoints, shaped by the evidence of what appears to have occurred over time, and constellated and valued under the auspices of an envisioned future course. We, of a Eusylvanian viewpoint, judge the processing of one's heritage as a critical element in the formation of one's self-conception. It's for us to engage with this task both personally and collectively, pursuing assorted means of exchanging, assessing, and aligning our findings with one another. A history remembered and processed productively can become a heritage that energizes and motivates, a sword by which to blaze one's forest path. We've applied already a sort of systems thinking in the realms of nature and companionship, and we can apply it in the heritage realm as well, for we are part of a time-bound system, a chronological body, a transpersonal process that reaches out over generations, one that spans millennia of human activity and endeavour. We affirm the value of connecting deeply with one's historical roots, with a coherent and traceable community in time. Humans are profoundly historical beings, shaped both in body and mind by countless ancestors. The more that we grasp this, the greater our perspicacity, and potentially the greater our sense of felt identity and purpose. There is humility in seeing ourselves as but one link in a long historical chain, a chain that is for the living to perpetuate in the best ways possible given the resources that are available to them. We've seen that the word humility stems from humus, signifying the ground or earth. It can also mean, etymologically, one's land or country. A definition, of course, that is in keeping with the values and concerns of the heritage quadrant. There is value in developing a deference, a veneration and respect for those who came before you, for they, in some sense, are you. They live in you. You are not so original. You're part of a bigger project, a project being literally something that is thrown forward. Something has indeed been thrown forward, and you are where it lands. We see goodness in meditating regularly upon the past, both personally and collectively. We welcome a multifaceted approach to one's heritage, one that employs the principles of the Eusylvanian quadrants. Start with where you are, with your own history, the history of your family, extending outward through layers of relatedness. Think also of the history of the living community to which you belong, as well as the history of the natural landscape in which you dwell. These are types of historical narratives that belong respectively to the realms of heritage, companionship, and nature. When combined, they can begin to form a living, dynamic whole. We recognize the need for a kind of nested approach to one's heritage. One that moves, for instance, from geographically proximate histories to those that may stretch around the globe, being mindful that closer histories will likely be processed with greater animation and feeling, whatever that feeling may be. We affirm the call to embrace expansive historical narratives, without losing sight, however, of the local, appreciating that just as we're shaped and guided by the features of our immediate communities and natural environments, so we are patterned and seasoned by the qualities and events of our more immediate histories. We see the embrace of these localisms as both healthful and empowering, judging our historical positions ever critically, but with positivity as well. An appreciation of the heritage realm can indeed enhance one's perspective and activities in the quadrants of nature and companionship. There is still the matter, though, of linking these realms together, of seeing them as part of a greater whole, a greater cosmos, a greater fabric of perceived reality. This is the topic that we'll turn to next time, when we consider the fourth Eusylvanian quadrant, the quadrant of mystery.